Yo, what's up guys? Todd from zeotag.com, and today we have an incredible episode for you. If you feel like your audience growth and engagement has gotten a little stagnant, this is definitely going to help you out. We have Kelly Campbell from the Thrive Your Agency Resource podcast to help you get aligned, authentic, and build a great podcast that your audience absolutely loves. Just a few of the things we cover are cultivating serendipity to organically attract high-quality guests, how you can get aligned with your mission to create great content, using that to be authentic and attract a really great and engaged audience, how you can pivot your content if you haven't been aligned yet by getting great feedback and putting out content tests to see what people are going to engage with, and how you can drive engagement while simultaneously boosting your company and your personal brand. So if you're looking to get more engagement on your podcast, sign up for your free Zeotag account today at zeotag.com, where you can start getting your podcast episodes automatically transcribed, fully searchable down to the timestamp, create an actionable table of content so that your viewers can easily see the different topics that you're talking about and click exactly what they want to hear and learn that will get them paying more attention to you, and all that kind of great stuff. So if you are ready to be authentic, get a little vulnerable, thank you so much, Kelly, for coming on the show and doing the same. Without further ado, here's my episode with Kelly. All right, Kelly Campbell, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to the show. While we get started, why don't you give a little background on who you are and what you have going on?
Yeah, sure, Todd. Thank you so much for having me. I love to have conversations about, what's going on in the podcasting world and all sorts of things around content and direction and all of that. So I'm sure we'll get into it. Yeah. But my background is basically that I had a digital marketing agency for about 14 years. I ended up selling that in 2016 and then was sort of like, hey, what am I going to do now? I'm 36 and kind of unemployable. So I really kind of took a few months to figure out that my passion, my expertise, all of the things that I wanted to do sort of looked like an agency growth consultant. Yeah. So I wanted to essentially become the type of coach or consultant that I wish I had when I was running my agency because I was a solo owner. Yeah. And so that's what I did. And I sort of created that, I didn't create the space because there were certainly a few people doing that, Carl Sakis and David C. Baker and all those pioneers. But so they sort of paved the way, and I looked at what they were doing and saw that I needed to figure out what my differentiation was. And for me, it was the fact that I did own an agency for that amount of time. I made tons of mistakes. I learned from those mistakes, and
Welcome
I thought,
to the party.
Yeah, and I thought, well, you know what? That's kind of valuable in and of itself, and that's certainly a differentiation. So, so I went into the space, and one of the first things that I thought about doing, it was sort of a no-brainer, was to start a podcast, because I thought, well, if my real intention here is to help other agency owners with really good content, answering the questions that are keeping them up at night, whether they're my clients or not, I want to put this content out there, right? So it was sort of like an impactful, very thoughtful, giving of content. And if some of them turned into clients, great. If some of them just got value from the content, even better. Yeah. So I was really comfortable with podcasting because I had also started a company back in 2006 or 7, where it was more of a health and wellness platform, we'll call it, sort of like the alternative version of WebMD. Ended up selling that in 2011. But
Nice,
one of the
congrats.
things, thank you. But one of the things that was really successful about that was podcasting back in 2007 was a total fad, right? It was so hard. The technology was not there. Yeah. The files were huge. You had to edit XML files to even upload it into iTunes. It was kind of a nightmare if you weren't a technical person. Yeah. So I got into that. And at that point, video podcasting was not even an option because of the technology from the user side. So I just did it as an audio show, and I had great guests. I had really, really well-known. I think I had Deepak Chopra's daughter on the show. I had Mayim Bialik from Big Bang Theory. She's a holistic mom. So I had some really incredible guests. So what happened was, through that, we ended up becoming, and again, take this with a grain of salt because it's podcasting in 2007, but we were the #1 show in the health space or the health category on iTunes for a solid year. Wow. And so that gave me sort of this confidence to say, hey, you know what? I can do this. There's no there's no, issue with it. And then so when I started the podcast for my consulting practice, that was about 3 years ago. I was like, hey, I'm going to up my game a little bit. I'm going to do video instead of just audio. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's very cool. I love it. And you talked about the content and topics and stuff like that. And so one of the things we talked about in a previous episode with Will Schultz from Impact Branding and Design, and he helps clients with figuring out their video strategy, was a big issue we see companies have today is trying to they don't want to give away the farm when it comes to information. And you said you want the content to be out there to help people, right? So how did you kind of come to terms with that? Like, was it ever an issue for you thinking like, am I giving away too much and how do you kind of advise people who are trying to do the same?
Yeah, so that's never my mindset. I don't operate from a place of that. For me, when I hear things like that, that means that signals to me that someone is operating from a place of scarcity or fear. It's the same reason why I don't believe that competition exists. I think that there's opportunity for everybody. There's more than enough business to go around, and there are opportunities for collaboration. So I might be in the minority with that viewpoint, but it's just not how I operate. So. I never had the thought that I was giving away too much content. I thought the content is going to be valuable to the people who are listening and watching. And I'm also giving other people the ability to, just be more visible in front of all of these agency owners and leaders who are the audience. So early on, what happened was I had brought on I was figuring out what the direction of the content was. I knew in the beginning it had to be very focused on tactics. So we talked about growth hacking. We talked about business development strategies. I brought the CEOs of different software companies onto the show. That, just as an aside, is the reason why I have a sponsor today and why I've had that same sponsor for the last 2.5 years. The CEO of that company was one of my guests early on. Nice. He ended up going back to his marketing firm at some point when they were looking for some way to get more valuable content in front of their audience, which is the same audience as mine. And so we brainstormed for a little bit and they said, let's just sponsor your podcast. You're already doing this. Let's just, put our name behind it and power it. Yeah, so,
I think that's a major area that's overlooked by people about the value of a podcast, where it can be such a great business development and networking tool where, a lot of people like to respond and say, yeah, I'll be on a podcast. And then you can create a relationship and add value and open a dialogue. And I think it's a great way to make connections like that too.
Yeah. Well, so I definitely had that as an intention. I looked at it as a potential business development tool. I never really thought about sponsorship because I was still in the process of questioning my own value and the value of my expertise. And I was in that space like 3 years ago. And, what that showed me was there's a lot of value in this, right? Yeah. And so anyway, as we kind of like moved along with the content, I realized over the course of this 2.5 years of having the show was that it wasn't necessarily the tactics that were differentiating my show, Thrive, from other shows. There were tons of shows out there that talked about business development, maybe not specifically for creative and technology agencies, but business development tactics in general, or growth hacking, or profitability, operations. There are tons of shows out there like that. Over the course of that time, as I started delving more into introspection and shadow work and mindfulness and all of these things, I realized that the feedback that I was getting from people who I was sharing that with, who were obviously agency owners, they were like, oh my God, I feel like that's what I've been missing. And so I kept hearing that over and over. And then little by little, I started trickling in guests that were a little bit disrupted in the way that I had been patterning the content of the show. And so I was getting, the feedback was coming in fast and furious for those shows and less for the more tactical shows. Yeah,
it's so great to see, like, when you take ownership of something that really aligns with you internally, to see how much more abundance it attracts, and like you just feel smoother and easier and lighter, right?
Yeah. Even as we're talking, I'm like getting lightheaded about it. It is. It's so much in alignment with exactly where I'm taking my consulting practice, the clients that I'm attracting now. These are very self-aware people who are like, hey, I'm not happy running this agency. We're doing okay. We could be doing better. I think I might be the reason why we're not doing better. I'm like, cool, you are the perfect client for me.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I define my ideal client now. So I thought if I align the content with more of those who I want to attract and the things that are very, innate and purposeful to me, that's where it's at. And so now the show, it's really funny. If you start looking at like the first 5 or 10 episodes, like the titles, and now what the titles look like, it is like a completely different show.
Well, and one of your most recent episodes, you actually had the guest did like a meditation thing for like 3-5 minutes or something like that, so like to go from, here's some growth hacking tactics on how to rank on Google to like, all right, if you're driving, don't do this, or pull over and close your eyes and take a deep breath, right? Like that's a far journey to come along.
Yeah. I know the show that you're talking about. It was Anahita Mogadam, who is my own Buddhist psychology coach. And so that episode was talking about mindfulness or mind training for agency leaders, and really like, what does it feel like to sit in the stillness and actually pause? Because all of us are, a lot of us are in the weeds. We're trying to put out client fires, deal with employees, trying to be the visionary, doing literally everything.
Yep.
And if we don't take that time to actually reset and just pause, we're no good, right?
Yeah.
Like we just can't. I mean, that's the whole basis of the oxygen mask theory. We have to take care of ourselves in order for us to take care of others.
Yeah.
So I think that is so important.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree, and I've I don't know if we even talked about this, but I've owned it, my agency since 2011, so I know I totally align with that side of things too. But I also think like even in, let's talk about for the video creators that we're talking to today, like I think that mindset thing and the intention setting of like before you and I got on a call, like I just took 30 seconds to sit down and like reset myself. Like I was just in another room talking about something totally different in a totally different energy, and like coming in here and say like, okay, let me like reset, let me focus on like, this is going to be an incredibly valuable conversation and episode with Kelly. Like it's going to go awesome. We're going to talk about these things and the audience is going to love it. All right, now, let me turn on the camera and call and whatever. Right. And I think, what do you see as, do you do a practice like that for your show? And are there any tips that you have for our listeners who, can maybe get out of the, setting up camera, doing all these things, running around and then like flipping it on? Like, how can you get your mind ready to create great content?
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about, your practice doing that before each show is really great. I may have to adopt that. I don't do that. I guess I have developed a meditation practice in the morning and even just getting outside in nature each day, trying to take a walk, even if it's 45 minutes at lunchtime, instead of sitting at my desk. Even though I work from home, sometimes I'll sit at my desk and eat lunch. Yeah. It's not thoughtful. It's not mindful. So I like to get outside. So if I can do that and obviously start my day with an actual meditation, whether that's 5 minutes or 50 minutes, right? Yeah. Whatever I have time for that day. But I do try to start my day that way. I don't start my day with social media, things along those lines that just, they set the tone for the entire day. And I don't want to set that tone. That's a choice. Right? Like we think of it as habitual, but it's actually a choice. You're consciously opening up that phone and deciding, I'm going to check my Instagram or this or that. Yeah. And I also start my days a little bit later because I have the ability to do that. So I don't work 9 to 5 as a consultant. I start my day at around 10:30, and I do the amount of work that needs to get done for that day. It's never past 5 o'clock ever, and most days it's not even that. Yeah. Plus, I'm having that time in the middle of the day, to go for that walk or whatever it is.
Right.
So I guess from that standpoint, I think what you're suggesting is probably a little bit more practical for agency owners, or just business owners in general, right? They don't have to be agency owners. Having maybe just prior to a meeting, just prior to a sales call, prior to a discovery, a podcast where you're being interviewed, whatever the situation is, when you're pivoting and you're resetting, literally just taking, it could be 60 seconds.
Yeah, that's all I do. Yeah.
Sit there with your feet grounded so that you're actually feeling that connection. I think in one of the episodes early on, it might have been with Scott Jeffrey, where it was probably the very first episode that I even talked about mindfulness or meditation or anything like that. He literally took you through why it was important to have your feet grounded when you're doing this pause, or even, as much as you can do it at your desk, because we have chi, we have energy, we have blood flowing through our extremities all day long. Well, when you actually take the time to plant your feet on the ground, you start to feel like a tingling, and you're like, that tingling should always be there. It's just that now you're aware of it, right? Yeah. And so you feel a little bit more rooted, you feel a little bit more grounded. And I don't mean that in like a woo-woo spiritual way. I mean, seriously, like you feel grounded. Your mind is not racing. You take the time to just kind of reset. Yeah. And you feel connected, and just a little bit more sure, a little bit more grounded in your posture. And now you take that breath, like I said, 60 seconds, close your eyes if you want to. You don't have to. Yeah. And then go about what you're going to do, especially when you're pivoting between running from one meeting to the next.
Yeah, and I think scientifically, actually, it is like the same way that there's an electrical ground on your wires, right? Like when you have like a 3-pronged outlet and you put it in, one of them is for grounding, I believe, and I can't speak to the science behind it, but I know that that's also like why humans should be like literally grounded from a scientific perspective, and that also plays into that. So it isn't just a whole woo-woo thing. Like there is, true physical scientific reasoning behind why that has such a positive impact.
Right. Well, think about it. I mean, the majority of our body is made up of water. Yeah. Right. So we're like kind of floating around all day long. If we don't sit down and actually feel rooted and planted and feel that grounding, we're just going to continue to kind of float in the ether.
Yeah, yeah. So you kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to hear like pre-mindful topics to post-mindful topics. Like how do you come up with the topics for your episodes, and how do you find the guests that match, or do you reach out to guests first and see what they want to talk about? Like what's your process for actually planning your show?
Oh, Todd, I wish I had a process. Again, it's just kind of like I am very organic, like the most organic you could possibly be about this show. I really believe, and again, I could be in the minority with this, I believe that the topics and the guests that are meant to be on the show are going to come to me. Yeah. Whether that's meeting them at a conference and they see me speak or I see them speak and we connect there and say, hey, I'd love to have you on the show. I really liked what you said about XYZ. I think that would be a great topic. Boom, that will be a guest. Actually, that's one of the guests I have coming up. It happened exactly like that. A few of them, actually. I was at Owner Summit for Bureau of Digital, and I've got a couple of people from that coming on, I think 3 or 4. Sometimes it's people that reach out to me through LinkedIn or through email or however they come across. Maybe they've seen something online. They've seen an article I've posted on LinkedIn or Medium, and they really resonate with it. Again, it's all in the context of the content that I'm talking about, though, right? Like, how can we fix the person so that they can help fix the agency? So I think it's definitely pretty diversified in terms of that. And then once in a while, there's just somebody that I meet in a networking setting or a personal setting. Like I said before, I had my own Buddhist psychology coach come on the show because I was like, well, who better to talk about this than the person who's training me? Yeah. Totally. So I think I just sort of let it happen organically. I think to me, that's always been the beauty of content marketing and putting out content too, is you're in a way, naturally forcing serendipity. Maybe force is the wrong word, but you're putting it out. Like, it would be one thing if you just sat in your office doing work all day, maybe talking offline about this stuff with these same people. But once you start publishing content, it creates this opportunity for serendipity that attracts all these people to you, right? Yeah. And so that was actually going to be part of the second half of my question. There was in the topics and stuff. Where was I going with my train of thought on that? Was forcing the serendipity, having the guests, but I guess, and attracting the audience. And so you touched on it where once you started putting this stuff out, you started getting much more feedback. So can you compare a little bit of like what the show was like before being more intentional with or more aligned with the content you talked about? And I think there's 2 things to that, right? There's you aligned it with yourself and your own passion. So owning that piece of your personality and being authentic to yourself. And then the other side of things is, like you mentioned,
having a differentiator, right? So I think when those two things overlap, that's when like the rubber really hits the road. So,
right.
You know, what was the show like from an audience engagement standpoint before, and what has it been since?
Yeah, before I even answer that question, I just want to touch back on something that you said about kind of getting that feedback. What I used to get that feedback,
or great point.
My moment of realization was that I actually started writing on Medium. And some of the things that I wrote on Medium, I also published on my blog, you know, on my actual website. But I started publishing some very, very vulnerable content on Medium. And one day I decided, well, I can't talk about vulnerability and I can't talk about introspection and being raw and transparent and honest if I'm not the one doing that first,
right.
Giving permission essentially to potential clients and other people in my life. So I took that on as like a little bit of a personal mission in a way. I was like, I want to, this is outside my comfort zone. So I was a CEO for 14 years. I wouldn't let anybody see what was going on inside of me.
Yeah.
There was no way you were going to do that. Everything was fine all the time. You know, no matter how stressed out I was. My wife at the time was the only person who ever saw that. And it was not a healthy way to live. So if I'm going to sit here and coach other people to drop that mask and stop talking about themselves in silos and talking about work-life balance, which actually doesn't exist. It's work-life integration. And you got to remember to put the play in there as well.
Yeah.
Forget that P word. So my testing ground was essentially, I didn't know it at the time, but it was publishing all of these things on Medium. And then there was one article that I decided to take outside of Medium and basically promote it right on LinkedIn, where I had 3,000 connections, all professional, obviously.
Yeah.
And I was scared shitless. I was like, oh my God, I'm really going to do this. I think Brene Brown calls it the vulnerability hangover. Uh-huh. So like you publish something and then the next day you're like, oh my God, I feel horrible. Like what's going to happen? The world is going to end, right? People are going to discover these things that I'm struggling with. And what happened was I ended up getting, no joke, probably about 70 messages between the comments on there, the comments or claps on Medium, personal text messages, emails. I mean, they were flooding in over the next few days.
Yeah.
Not one of them was negative. And so that led me to continue to publish things like that. And I was like, this is all in alignment. I have to take the content in this direction because people are really starving for it.
Yeah.
These leaders are feeling really lonely. I don't want them to feel that way. That's part of my purpose, is to make them feel not so alone.
Yeah.
And so to answer your main question, what the engagement on the content looked like early on, again, it was a brand new show, right?
Yeah.
So, you have to take that into consideration.
Yeah.
The engagement was decent, right? It was very relevant to the agency leaders. Mm-hmm. They wanted to know, this is again 3 years ago, before the Brene Browns of the world sort of opened this whole space up for us.
Yeah.
In a mainstream way anyway. But the engagement on the show was, I would get feedback. I would get emails from agency owners like, that was a great episode. There were so many takeaways. People would suggest other guests like, oh, because you talked about this aspect of business development, like account-based marketing, for example, why don't you have this guy in the show?
Right.
I used him as a consultant for this, or, whatever. So the engagement, it was good, but it was nothing like it is now. Yeah. And again, that's over the course of time, you grow an audience. I have a sponsor. Yeah. I'm sending the content out on LinkedIn, and it's published on all the different platforms, iTunes, Vimeo, YouTube, SoundCloud, Anchor, Spotify, right? So it has a bigger reach now. And that sponsorship from Workamajig obviously catapulted that, because they're sending it out via email to their audience, as well as I'm sending it out to my audience of like 5,000 agency owners. Yeah. So yes, of course it's going to grow just from those perspectives, but the engagement is different from growth, right? Like engagement, you can look at like how many people actually viewed this or listened to it from start to finish. Mm-hmm. I don't look at that as necessarily, yes, it's part of engagement.
Sure.
But for me, I want the feedback. I want this to be more of a dialogue, not just a monologue or having these agency leaders listen to or watch these shows as if it's a split screen conversation between myself and the guest. Yeah. And you're just a fly on the wall. I want them to be part of the conversation, even if it's after the fact. So engagement has gone up pretty significantly.
How do you kind of facilitate that happening once you publish? I know you said you distribute it, but I know it's not just a publish and pray thing, right? So if you want to get them engaged after the fact, like you just said, like what are some tips you have for people that want to drive that engagement for people so that it is? And I believe all marketing should really be a dialogue, not a monologue.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found most successful is that obviously email, not just having the podcast actually published.
Right. Like, hey, new episode, click here, but...
Well, what I'm saying is not just the distribution of where it exists, right? Yeah. Because your existing subscribers are going to be notified that you have a new show. New people who stumble upon that show in those various places, they'll subscribe.
Yeah.
The email basically takes the people who you already have a relationship with, and it puts that right into their inbox. So I don't know of a lot of podcasts who actually take that step where they themselves, like the host or the company who's producing it, pushes an email out to whatever their list is. Then their sponsor, if they have one, pushes it out to their email list. The sponsor also publishes it on their website, which is essentially like a microsite for the show specifically. Yeah. Then what I do is on LinkedIn, I'll publish it on my company LinkedIn page and then share it share it personally or share it in my profile. A lot of times the feedback is coming more from the emails and the LinkedIn than anything else.
Yeah.
So I think you do have to, distribution, of course, that's how people are going to find it.
Right.
But it is about promoting it in some way. Yeah. And, with the sponsorship, I can throw a few dollars to promoting it to other agency leaders who may have not heard of the show. And I'm not talking about a lot of money, $50 to $100 an episode.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, even what we do is we have $1 a day running to just retarget, our existing engaged audience, our email subscribers, and our website visitors, just to make sure that, organic promotion doesn't really get the job done. You want, just $1 a day. And if you're publishing content that you don't think is going to return more than $1 a day of value to your business, then maybe you need to rethink your strategy, right? So, I totally agree. And creating that dialogue, I think, is so huge. And I love that you're not just doing it from the company, but you do company share and then share it to your personal, and
what that does is it also increases the followers for the company. Right. So, I'm trying to get double duty out of it.
Yeah.
What I try to think about is always how to work smarter, not harder. Right. And are there things that I can do? So, for example, really quick instance of this. I publish the podcast itself. Mm-hmm. I take a Vimeo video because I just like the player of Vimeo much better than YouTube.
Yeah.
So I take the video from Vimeo. I publish that as essentially like a blog post, but it's a category of the podcast, right? On my WordPress site. That WordPress site has a plugin so that automatically once it goes onto the blog or onto the website, let's just call it, it automatically goes to YouTube and all of these other places.
Nice.
So it's just a way where I don't have to touch multiple things.
Yeah.
And so, if someone is thinking about or struggling with oh my God, this is going to be totally overwhelming to start this new show that I have in mind. How am I going to get it out to all these places? Is it really technical? WordPress, just as an example, makes it really, really easy to distribute it in a lot of different places. And I will say that Anchor has been great because I put the trailers, 5-minute trailers for the show on Anchor. Now Anchor has distribution with tons and tons.
Yeah, everybody, I think. Yeah.
Right? That's how it got onto Spotify and all these other things. So you could literally publish it in 2 places and have it live in about 10.
Yeah. I think that's a great approach to having it. And, I love that, you really aligned you recognized early. Oh, actually, let me ask, how long did it take you to make that kind of pivot? And I know maybe it did happen kind of a little gradually, but how many episodes in were you, or at what point did you realize to start, making?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to say it was about, so if I've been doing it for 2.5 years, I would say literally at the halfway mark.
Okay. So it wasn't like, you had a couple episodes and you were like, I don't think this is it. Like you were in.
I was in. I mean, I publish every other week. Yeah. And I was in, I want to say the Scott Jeffrey episode, which is kind of what I'm counting as the pivot or the beginning of the pivot. I think that was around episode 31 or 34. And I'm just going to be publishing episode 66 tomorrow. Yeah. So it was pretty much exactly the halfway mark between when I started and now.
Yeah. And, the other thing, and the other thing I love about, the response that you got when you put out that first very vulnerable piece and going forward is, it's great that you personally got this boost of like, oh, people are interested in this. But think about the 70 people who responded back to you and then on Medium and all those people in the emails. Those people were wanting this conversation and weren't able to have it or hear it or be a part of it as a community yet. And like that's 70 plus lives that you've been able to touch and change and bring them something that they were. Not to sound dramatic, but change their life a little, even if in a little way, where, bringing this kind of conversation. And I think just having that as alignment for yourself, alignment with bringing the audience something that they really wanted and creating a differentiator for yourself is really, it's awesome that you took that somewhat of a risk. And I know those things feel huge at the time, but like, what was the worst that was going to happen? You didn't get any comments on the post, like,
No, for me, honestly, like what I was worried about was probably because I tried to think about it, like right before I published it. I was like, okay, what is the worst thing that's going to happen? The worst thing that would have happened is that, again, this is all like self-talk, but like I'm just putting it out there, right? Because I'm sure if I'm thinking it, somebody else is thinking it. That's
exactly.
So the worst thing that could happen in my mind was that people would think she doesn't have all of her shit together. Mm-hmm. My perception of her changes. Mm-hmm. Maybe she's not as competent as I thought she was. We're getting really deep here because like, this is awesome. This is great. This is like a therapy session. Yeah. I could have also received feedback like, glad that you published this piece and that you're working on this stuff yourself, but LinkedIn is a professional platform and this doesn't really have a place here. Yeah. All of these things were the things that I like, the stories I told myself. Right. I know that people, if you go through Landmark and things like that, this is the language that they use. Yeah. And I get a lot of flack from some of my friends who are like, okay, the stories, the narratives, but it's
that's everything. I mean, you mentioned Deepak Chopra before, like he just came out with a new book, so he's been on a lot of stuff. And I mean, all of our reality is a story that humanity has made, right? So I mean, it is what it is.
It is what it is. But these were all the narratives that I created, all the stories that I told myself about what could happen. And the reality was it took a lot of courage. And that was a lot of the feedback that I got was like, wow, this was the bravest thing that you could have ever done, because I was very vulnerable about a lot of things in my personal life and what I was struggling with. And the majority of the people that were coming back to say, this was so brave. Yeah. The things that you're talking about are things that I struggle with too. And some people felt comfortable enough to put that out as a comment on LinkedIn, which to me was probably, even though I appreciated all the emails and the text messages and that, the people who commented on LinkedIn, to me, that was brave. Yeah. Right? Because they were essentially not just saying, hey, good job. A lot of them were saying, this took a lot of courage. It was very brave. And by the way, I'm also struggling with these things, and you've just given me the permission to admit that in the same exact forum. And I was like, man, that's community. Yeah. Okay. Now we're all in this together. Talk about oneness. Yeah. I mean, this is all my love language.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this is, I would say, an easier topic for people to feel that sense of community around, but really that's the whole purpose of creating content and putting it out in any fashion, regardless of what your topic or pillar or rallying cry is around.
True. I will add to that or build on that to say that podcasting in particular, I think gives you just a little bit more, because think about what podcasting is, right? You're either watching or listening, but there's certainly an audio component every time. You're in someone's ear. Yeah. That's a very intimate place to be, right? And you're in their ear for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe even an hour if you have a longer show. That is, I mean, when do you get to be in someone's ear for that amount of time.
Yeah.
It's super intimate. So there's a trust that gets developed. There's there is a relationship that gets developed through a podcast, which is why I love the medium.
Yeah, same. And I think that's a great point to wrap up on. And we hit a lot of great stuff here. And I'm really grateful for you to come on and share your story and be a little vulnerable with us today. And I hope that we're able to help give permission to our audience, if they needed it, to be a little more authentic and vulnerable themselves, to attract the people that they're going to love being with, right? And that's what putting out quality content that aligns with yourself is going to do. It's going to attract the people that you should be around. And thank you so much. So tell us, where can people find you? Where can they subscribe and get more of Kelly Campbell?
Yeah, so get more of Kelly Campbell. That's pretty funny. So the show is called Thrive, Your Agency Resource. And as I said before, it's on iTunes, SoundCloud, all the typical places where you would find the podcast. And then my website is just my name, klcampbell.com.
All right, awesome. Kelly, thank you so much for coming on the show. And everybody, thanks for watching and listening. And we'll catch you on the next episode.